Hey everyone, it's Hannah Saber from HR Images. In today's video, we'll be doing a side-by-side comparison between the Sony 135mm versus the Samyang 135. So stay tuned. So like my previous videos, if you look at the description below, I'll have each category in a time. So then if you do want to skip ahead, feel free to do so. So I'll have them separated like bokeh, sharpness, autofocus, chromatic aberration, and so on. Build quality. So build quality on the lenses, they are side by side. The Samyang is a little bit taller than the Sony. Both have an 82mm thread. If you look at the Samyang, it looks a little bit fatter than the Sony. Now, the Sony G Master, like all G Masters, they do have the aperture ring. So you got the clicking on and the declick off, as well as two focus hold buttons. The Samyang does have a focus hold button, but it does have a mode 1 and mode 2. So mode 2 function then turns the focus ring into an aperture ring. The only thing is it doesn't have that clicking option. So if you do shooting stills and you want to make sure to know if you are changing aperture, it does not have the clicking option as the Sony, but it is great for videos because I know a lot of videographers do not like that clicking sound, so they hate using the aperture ring for that particular reason. In terms of weight, the Sony does weigh at 950 grams, whereas the Samyang is around 772 grams, if I'm correct. Yeah, 772 grams. So the Samyang is lighter, even though it's a little bit taller than the Sony G Master. So the G Master is actually a little bit heavier than the Samyang. They both have that switch on the end, so you can actually go into macro mode. So closest minimum focus distance on the Samyang is 69 centimeters, whereas the Sony is 70 centimeters. So there isn't much difference. They are very identical in terms of the minimum focus distance. Eye autofocus. If you are looking at this video side-by-side comparison in the eye autofocus, as my son is moving around, turning around, you can see how the eye autofocus does nail the eye. So even if he's turned around, the tracking still tracks on his head, and then as it comes in with his eyes, it does catch his eyes very quickly. So the eye autofocus on both of them are very accurate and very snappy, so it does hold on with the eye autofocus. Now, if you're looking at this image, I've shot a quick portrait of my son using eye autofocus, looking at this side by side, Samyang being the left, Sony being the right. They look identically sharp. The Samyang does favor a bit more of a warmer tone, whereas the Sony does tend to lean more in slightly cooler tones. Now, side by side, they look equally sharp, but then when you zoom in on the eye, the eyelashes and around his eyelid areas, they're both equally sharp. If you look inside the iris of the eye, they are sharp, but if you notice, the Sony G Master is a tad sharper. It retains the detail of his eyelash reflection as well as the house in the background, whereas the Samyang is a tad softer than the Samyang. So the Sony is a tad sharper than the Samyang in terms of eye autofocus, nailing the eye autofocus in the sharpness. But if you're looking at them at regular distance, equally they are the same side by side. Bokeh. The bokeh comparison between the Sony and the Samyang being left, Sony being right. If you notice in the center, the bokeh balls on the Samyang retains its rounded shape, whereas the edges, it goes into that egg shape like on the edges, except the center. Whereas Sony, their bokeh balls right through the image, it holds that egg-shaped bokeh. So the Samyang does have a nice pleasing bokeh to look at in the center compared to the Sony. If we go into the minimum focus distance on both of them, at 69 centimeters on the Samyang, which is on the left, and 70 centimeters on the Sony on the right. You cannot tell the difference between the two in terms of 69 and 70 centimeters, so I would call them both at 70 centimeters. But if you look at the bokeh in the center, The Sony on the right starting to have a bit more round in their bokeh. You do still have a lot of the egg shape close up, whereas the Samyang still holds more of the roundness in the bokeh. Very minimal egg shaped bokeh on the edges, unlike the Sony. It's more vivid compared to the Samyang. So Samyang does have a bit more pleasing rounded bokeh balls to look at. Now, lens flare and chromatic aberration. So here's lens flare we'll talk about. So Samyang on the left, Sony on the right. They both have nice star trails lines on the sun shooting at f9. The Sony does have introduced a little bit of lens flare, if you notice here on the image, whereas the Samyang, you don't get much lens flare on their image. So Samyang does hold and handle the lens flare a bit better than what the Sony does. Now the Sony is not their lens flare is not very bad to say, oh, it's not usable. It adds a bit of characteristics to your image depending on what you're shooting. But the Samyang does hold the lens flare a bit better than the Sony. If you notice again, Samyang favors more the warmer tones, where Sony favors more the cooler tones. Now, if you're looking at chromatic aberration, looking at this image side by side, Samyang on the left, Sony on the right, you can't tell any chromatic aberrations. So they do actually handle it very well. The only time you do notice it, if you start to pixel peep. So if you notice on the Samyang on the bottom of the leaf, you notice that slight orange color fringing on the Samyang, whereas the Sony on the top of the leaf, you see that purpley, bluey fringe. But they do handle the color fringing very well. So unlike other some lenses where if you look at the image just at normal, you can very notice the chromatic aberration on the leaves or whatever it is that you're shooting. Whereas both the Samyang and the Sony does handle it very well. Until you pixel peep is when you start to see it. Sharpness. Now, if you're looking at here, the lines on the barrel distortion, it handles both the lenses very well. If you're looking at sharpness, Samyang on the left and Sony on the right, both are equally sharp wide open. If you look at the numbers and the center, they both look equally sharp in the center. If you're looking at it on the edges, looking again at the number, the 4, 3, again, they look equally sharp. I haven't noticed any difference. So they're both sharp wide open and they are very identical in terms of the sharpness. Now, when we stop down to f5, if you're looking at the center, the Sony does pick up the sharpness a bit better than what the Samyang does. The Samyang still looks sharp, but if you're comparing the Sony does look a little bit sharper, is a bit sharper than the Samyang at f5. Even at the corners, it's the same thing, where the edges, the Sony is a bit sharper than the Samyang. Samyang is a bit softer. So at f5, the Sony does become a bit more sharper than what the Samyang is. Autofocus for stills. Now, this video side-by-side comparison is in low light. If you're looking at the comparison in low light for videos, they both equally handle the focusing very well. There is no hunting, it's very smooth, the transition's beautiful. I couldn't tell any focus breathing on either of the lenses, and for autofocus for video, they both perform really well. Now, if you're looking at autofocus for video in normal daylight, side by side comparison, the Sony is a bit snappier and quicker. Now, they both shot at the same settings on the S3, so I have not changed the settings. Now, the Sony G Master is a bit snappier than the Samyang. The Samyang is a bit slower, but if you look at it, the Samyang looks a bit smoother than what the Sony is. The snappier pace from the Sony just looks a bit jaggedy, whereas the Samyang has that, even as slow, it has a little bit slower, it has that nice smooth transition. But I did notice that sometimes the Sony would not catch my eyes. It will take a bit to actually catch my eyes. I was at a safe distance where the lens will still pick me up as normal at stills and everything, but for some reason, it didn't happen all the time. It's just every now and then, once a blue moon, I would get that little struggle that it catches focus, it will take a while, whereas the Samyang didn't have that. So I did find the Samyang focusing to catch on better than the Sony, even though it's a little bit slower. But this is from what I've been finding, and you can see the side-by-side comparison for yourself as well. Now, autofocus for stills. Autofocus for stills in low light, it is both equally the same. I haven't noticed any hunting. I haven't noticed any struggle. They both perform very well in stills for autofocus in low light. If we look now at daytime, the daytime in perfect lighting condition, the autofocus is faster than what it was in low light, but again, they perform equally well on the autofocus. So I couldn't tell any difference from when I was testing it, but here's a side-by-side comparison for you to be the judge. That gives a quick rundown on a side-by-side comparison between these two lenses, the Samyang versus the Sony. I hope this video is helpful for you guys. For the price of the Sony at $2,700, comparing it to the Samyang at $1,500 Australian. Look, the Samyang, to be honest, for the price it is, it actually does very well and actually comes very close to G Master from what I'm seeing. It just depends on you guys whether you want the G Master quality, the G Master branding. You know, you might find that the Sony will be a better option for you. You might find the Samyang a better option for you. I've personally, people who know me and follow me on my socials as well as my YouTube, they know I would not shoot a lens that I would not like or I don't find perform well. I have tested both these lenses on professional shoots, weddings and events, and I'll be honest, I have not noticed any difference. There was no struggle. The clients were very happy. They didn't even see the difference in change of quality. They were very impressed of my results and how I've done. And these both lenses have actually performed really well on every event that I've done. So side by side, I could not fault them. And it actually made it harder for me to actually pick which one I want to use when I'm shooting an event. I do love the Samyang 135. Again, for the price, you're getting a well-performed lens. For the G Master, you're getting a bit more extra in terms of the aperturing, the declick function, a bit snappier in video, so that might be a better option for you. But do leave your comments below. Let me know which one you've picked and which one you prefer and why. If you did enjoy the video, please give it a like, share and subscribe to the channel and hit the bell notification button to get notified for any future videos. Until then guys, have a good night and we'll catch you later. See ya.